You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm pleased to return once again with a brand new Van Melsen yarn. In case number 14, The Town on the Borderland, our intrepid PI finds himself in the sleepy northern town of Starry Edge, where a handful of residents have mysteriously locked themselves in their homes, refusing all contact with the outside world. This is the last Van Melsen short I'm planning to publish prior to the release of my first Van Melsen novel, The House That Wax Built, which I'm currently drafting. If, however, I'm unable to finish the book in a timely fashion, I will look at writing another short. I have the entire third volume outlined. And just a quick reminder that the second volume is now available in ebook format. I'll include some links below. Thanks all. I hope you enjoy today's offering. The Town on the Borderland by Ian Gordon. The following is an unpublished letter, written circa December 1990, when Van Melsen was a resident of the County Durham market town of Barnard Castle. 1. Dear blank, why is it that people refuse to believe we live in a haunted world? It's 1:03 a.m. as I write this, sitting here in the shadow of the North Pennines, a wilderness home to spectres and wild things. Would a non-believer hike to High Force at this hour and bathe in its moon-kissed waters? Would a skeptic spend a night atop Cross Fell, endure the ghosts of the North borne to him by the helm wind? Not likely. Unpeopled though those spots assuredly are at the present moment, they're not without their inhabitants. I know, for I've seen them, spoken to them, dealt with them. They're out there. Always have been. Forgive me, I'm emotionally compromised. The whole business has been trying. It'll take more than a cup of tea to recover from this one. Well, you asked me to head up to Starry Edge. Vague though your reasons were, I obliged. When have I ever declined such an offer? Let's get to it. I'll spare you the finer details of my journey up there. Let's just say that I made it as far as Cotton's Hope Burnfoot before I ran out of favours. From there, I took the decision to walk the remaining 6 miles, following Cotton's Hope Road directly north. A barren stretch, complete with icy tarmac and snow-sprinkled trees. Fortunately, I was prepared for the hike, and completed the final leg in a little over 2 hours. You haven't been to Starry Edge, have you? Well, I should say that it's rather beautiful, as viewed from the junction of Cotton Soap Road and Nightingale Rise. Great Scots pine like silent sentinels, standing guard to the west, waves of gently undulating hills to the east, smoke billowing from distant chimneys, the scattered dwellings they belong to tranquil and quaint. Twilight was fading as I reached the edge of town, colouring the snowy trees and numerous rooftops a provocative pink, a rich and vibrant glow that was suggestive of things to come. I'd arranged accommodation in advance, a well-equipped cottage opposite the Hare-and Behemoth, and found myself within its shelter just after sundown. My contact, Mr. Ranakar, was set to pay me a visit the following morning, so I dedicated myself to the act of idle study, sitting by the window, gazing out into the night, consuming cup after cup of piping hot Darjeeling. It's funny, I've been up north just over 2 years now, and despite the number of times I've taken to the Pennines in search of peace and fresh air, I'd never prior to that moment by the window looked up at the stars and pondered. It's a dark sky preserve up there. I suppose you know that already. And boy, do those pinpoints of light cry for attention. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and yet there they were, billions of celestial bodies in a moonless sky, penetrating my soul. I felt it there and then, my proximity to something alien. My grip tightened on the cup, and I thought of Pictol, and all the lonelier stars that have their place, calm lamps within the distant southern sky, and planet dust upon the edge of space, look down upon the fretful world, and I look up to outer vastness unafraid, and see the stars which sang when earth was made. Ranakar was punctual, arrived at 9 a.m. on the button. He introduced himself as Bill, after which I invited him in and handed him a cup of coffee. A cloud of cold entered the cottage, necessitating a couple of extra logs on the fire. We sat by the blaze, as Bill, a slender middle-aged chap with a strong chin, got to the business at hand. The trouble, as he called it. Seems your source was on the money. On November 25th, without any clear reason, numerous people chose to isolate themselves in their homes, ignoring friends and family, deaf to knocks at the door, and avoiding all contact with the outside world. And there was a weird smell in the air, said Bill. Smell? I probed. Yeah, a real funk. Surprised you didn't catch a whiff of it on your way over here. I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. The only smell in the air the night before had been that of firewood coughed up by the many chimneys. Can you offer any insight, I began, as to why these people are refusing to leave their homes? Bill shook his head. Afraid not, Peter. It's a real mystery. 1 minute they're out and about doing normal things, Rob at the general store, Mabel at the boutique, then all of a sudden locked up at home, curtains drawn, lights out. It all sounded very unusual to me. Prominent members of the community stricken by an inexplicable urge to withdraw from public view. And there's been no contact with them whatsoever? No. Well, Bill hesitated. Not really. Not really. The lean chap sighed. A youngster, he said, Tim Bank, says he caught a glimpse of Mabel a few days ago. Out and about? Oh, no. Through a crack in the curtains, apparently. Said she looked strange. Bigger, for a start. Much bigger. Like she'd swallowed a house. And she's been in hiding for how long? Barely a week, Bill answered, taking a sip of coffee. Did Mabel see the boy at the window? Dunno. Tim was spooked by the sight of her. Took off running. I frowned. Couldn't have been taking you for a ride, could he? No, not Tim. I know he's just a lad, but he's not one to tell a tale. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. How about family members? That's the thing. All of those affected live alone. No partners or surviving family members. And how many are affected, would you say? 5 in all. In addition to Rob Stanley and Mabel Mason, Val Mabry, chemist, Daniel Snyder, teacher, and town patriarch Raven Barkley, though Raven's always been a bit on the reclusive side. Well, I piped up, puffing out my chest assertively. They're going to run out of supplies soon enough. And then, as the thought occurred to me, they're not preppers, are they? Preppers? Never mind. Bill proceeded to tell me what he knew of the numerous attempts made to rouse the introverts, including the rather aggressive approach taken by a local farmer by the name of George Emery, involving small stones and windows, none of which yielded the desired result. A rough map of the town had been sketched for me, on which Bill had marked the addresses of all concerned, as well as that of the Bank family, should the desire to consult young Tim arise. I clutched the proffered item eagerly, keen to crack on with my investigation. But I had one last question to put to my strong-chinned contact. As far as you can recall, did anything else of significance occur on November 25th? Not that I know of, Bill answered, though I could tell from the way he answered that he was holding something back. I'd learn what that was a bit later. With that, Bill Ranakar took his leave, and I was left holding the sheet of A4 paper he'd handed me, complete with its crude outlines. My first port of call would be the bank house, just round the corner on Church Fields. I was eager to get a better description of the large woman confined to the 2 up, 2 down on Addicombe Gardens. Starry Edge, a remote town on the border of England and Scotland, high in Northumberland National Park, was caked in snow, and on the morning of December 2nd was extremely cold. The fur-lined winter coat I wore my only safeguard against the elements. I lit a cigarette, puffing rings of smoke into the cool air, and then I set off on my way, following the hand-drawn map. Reaching Church Fields, I immediately encountered an item of strangeness. In the middle of the pavement, protruding from the compacted snow like an inquisitive periscope, stood an odd, flowering plant. The head of the plant was especially curious, perfectly spherical like the seed head of a dandelion, but bright pink, in direct contrast to the surrounding whiteness. There was an unusual quality to the thing, vital somehow, in spite of the freezing conditions. Botany has never been my strong suit, so I gave the plant a wide berth, careful not to brush against it. As I passed, I wondered if the locals would be just as cautious, or if, in these snowy Northumberland hills, such a thing was entirely unremarkable. But as I said, botany and I make for uneasy bedfellows. On I ambled, tramping through the white stuff in quest of the bank house, passing many a quiet abode, all adorned with the familiar garish ornaments and furnishings of the festive period. Outwardly jovial though these properties were, I saw few signs of merry life at the back of them. The occasional grumpy cat on a windowsill, the barely visible silhouette of a hunched figure sitting in front of a blandly blinking television. Before long, I reached the charming bank residence, where it seemed my arrival had been anticipated. For at the door, a beaming smile from ear to ear, stood the youngster himself, Tim, a boy of 13 or 14 years, waving at me. "Expecting someone?" I called as I opened the gate at the front of the house. "I think so," the boy called back. I soon saw that the boy's parents weren't far behind, the father wearing an expression of exasperation, probably owing to the amount of cold the boy was letting into the house. And quite a property it was, a townhouse over 3 stories, windows in the Georgian style, and a most delightful wooden porch. "The name's Van Melsen," I said, extending a hand to the boy's father, "but you can call me Peter." "Pleased to meet you," said Mr. Bank, a short fellow with a friendly, round face. "Bill said you might pop round," added Mrs. Bank, a tall lady towering over her husband, her bantam face framed by a wonderful shock of beautiful blonde hair. "And you must be Tim," I went on, nodding at the child. "Pleased to meet you," he said, echoing his father. In a matter of minutes I was seated in a crowded reception room, nursing a cup of English breakfast. What can I say? It was just one of those days. Perched there, the blood rushing back into my face, I listened to young Tim as he recited the particulars of his trip to Mabel Mason's place. "They were all talking about it at school," he began. "5 of 'em locked in their houses, none of 'em wanting to come out. Weird, eh?" "Weird indeed," I agreed, nodding approvingly. "So anyway," Tim continued, "I went up there after school on Tuesday." "The 27th, Mrs. Bank clarified. "Yeah, the 27th, the boy said. "Went up there to see Mrs. Mason. Used to go all the time when I was younger. I'd pick flowers for her and sell 'em. Traded 'em for biscuits," Mr. Bank put in. "Anyway," Tim barked, his face ruddy with excitement, "I went up there to see her, to see if there was anything I could do to cheer her up. I figured she was upset about something, and I didn't like the idea of that, because she was always nice to me and my mates when we were kids." "When you were kids?" I blurted. "I'm 14 now, Mr. Van Melsen." Suppressing a smirk, I said, "Fair enough." "Anyway," the boy said again, "I went up there and knocked at the door. Lots of other people had already been up there. The snow was trampled right down, footsteps everywhere, but I really felt like I could cheer her up. She didn't answer the door, so I went on knocking for a bit, before I decided to try something else. Here the boy paused, as though trying to work out exactly how to word the next part of his tale. I opened the letterbox and shouted into it. "Mabel," I yelled. "Are you in there, Mabel? It's me, Timothy Bank. Just checking up on you, Mabel. Wanted to see if you were all right, that's all." But nothing. No reply. And when I put my ear against the letterbox, I couldn't hear anything either. Again the boy paused, seeming to have lost a bit of momentum. And then, he uttered of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving in the front window. And when I looked, I saw that the curtains were fluttering, like Mrs. Mason had tiptoed over to see who was at the door. Tim leaned forward, a playful look crossing his features. The square spectacles he wore slid down to the tip of his nose, revealing the true size of the large blue eyes that had been squatting behind them. "So, I sneaked up to the window," he went on, whispering, trying my best to be quiet, and saw that there was a crack in the curtains. And just like that, the boy ran out of steam and fell into a stupor. "It's all right," Mr. Banks said. "Take your time." "That's right, Tim," I added. "As long as you need." Eventually, encouraged by his parents and a handful of pink bonbons that seemed to materialize out of thin air, the boy got to the heart of the matter. "I saw her," he said, his voice barely audible now. "She was in the living room, but it wasn't the Mrs. Mason I knew. Whoever she was just sitting there on the sofa, the big brown sofa that's always been there, but she was all blown up like a balloon. Her head was like a big pumpkin, and her eyes—" Tim took a deep breath, gobbling a sizable bonbon in the process. "She was just gazing off into space," he mumbled. "Her eyes were all red and swollen." "Was she breathing, Tim?" I asked, aware that the boy might not be able to answer the question. "I think so," he said, "because she coughed or something, which scared the hell out of me." "And nobody has been up there since?" I asked, concerned for the lady who, from what I could gather, was confined to her home alone, and quite possibly in a very bad way. "Well, yeah," this from Mrs. Bank. "The second I saw the look on Tim's face, I went up there. After all, it's only a 2-minute walk from here." I nodded, studying her intently. "But as I approached the door," she said, "I heard voices inside. A heated exchange between Mrs. Mason, her voice is unmistakable, and someone else whose mode of speech was odd and difficult to understand." "What was Mrs. Mason saying?" I asked. "I don't know," Mrs. Banks said, shrugging her shoulders. "I only know that she seemed to be upset about a visitor, somebody who had overstayed their welcome, something like that." Again I nodded, swallowing what remained of my English breakfast. "Bill Ranakar mentioned a funny smell," I said. "Notice anything like that, either of you?" "Oh, yeah," Tim barked. "Really bad smell over there. You caught a whiff of it too, didn't you, Mum?" "I did," Mrs. Bank confirmed. "Like rotten fruit. Awful." That was about all I could extract from the Bank family. Tim had nothing else to add, and Mrs. Bank had meanwhile decided that it was none of her business to interfere with the affairs of a headstrong pensioner. But I didn't like the boy's description of the lady one bit. What was at the back of this sudden decision to detach herself from the community? My other concern was the possibility of a visitor. Was Mrs. Mason hosting an old friend? A distant relative, perhaps? Someone unfamiliar to the town at large? Or had another figure called on her? Someone persuasive enough to keep her behind closed doors indefinitely? The same figure who had disturbed the curtains during Tim's unexpected visit. Had you given me more to go on when you called, I might have been better prepared. But as it stood, I was stumbling in the dark, blind as a bat, though not for the first time, I have to admit. And so I left the house on Church Fields, moving swiftly in the direction of AUDIBLE Gardens. 2. Mrs. Bank was correct. The walk from Church Fields would have taken no more than 2 minutes, had I not paused several times along the way. Twice I was certain I was being followed, trailed by persons unseen, and with that creeping sensation came an odor, the very smell the Banks had described, rot, sickly sweet, yet unmistakably rot. Mrs. Mason's door loomed ahead of me, a door belonging to a very small, terraced house, with an equally slight yard between it and the pavement. And in that yard was another red-flowered plant, standing proud above the trampled snow. This one was a little different, though. The dandelion-like head had been interfered with, giving it the appearance of a crescent blood moon. And, on the ice below, a pink stain was visible, created presumably by the contents of the seed head. I didn't like the look of it. Nothing natural about it, I thought, despite my lack of knowledge on the subject. But, as I've said many times before, one must trust one's instincts, especially in this line of work. Shunning the strange flower, I tried my luck at Mrs. Mason's weathered door, remarking, as I did so, the front window, looking for signs of movement. As might be expected, there was no response to my incessant knocking, nor were there any twitching of curtains. I tried to get a look at the living room, but of course the curtains had been drawn back together. The prickly hairs on the back of my neck told me that there was someone on the other side of that curtain, someone who either lacked the inclination or physical ability to acknowledge my call. And my intuition told me something else, too, that you were right to contact me. Something highly unusual was going on, and my curiosity had been well and truly piqued. Giving up on Mrs. Mason for the time being, I decided to move on, eager to assess the homes of the other shut-ins. Now let me just say that it was I who approached the stranger. Following Bill's map, I located a ginnel connecting AUDIBLE Gardens to Orchard Terrace, the latter in the so-called Scottish Quarter, home to many who still consider Starry Edge to be a Scottish settlement. The reputed town patriarch, Raven Barclay, had his residence up there, and his was the closest to Mason's. I entered the ginnel, and ahead I saw a figure ambling towards me, a shady character who, on seeing me, did his darndest to backtrack. Observing this behavior, I felt it necessary to approach the man. "Excuse me," I said, increasing my pace, but the figure failed to respond. "Excuse me," I called again. "I wonder if you can help me." This latter query seemed to stall the man. With some palpable reluctance, he stopped in his tracks, turned, and waited for me to reach him. The oddly elfin fellow greeted me with a nod of the head, a head somewhat obscured by a mass of thick, wiry hair. "Sorry to bother you," I went on, scanning him up and down, "but I'm looking for Orchard Terrace." This, of course, was a ruse. I knew exactly where the street was, but I wanted to test him. Was he a local? I have to say he certainly didn't look the part. I saw red hair and green eyes, belonging to a gaunt face, pale in the extreme. His crooked frame was like that of a nonagenarian, though the smooth pink skin of his face suggested a youngster. He was dressed in casual clothing, a khaki jacket and dark trousers, but the garments were oversized and seemed to billow like bedsheets on a washing line. Were those tattoos that crisscrossed his pink hands? I can't be sure. I only caught a fleeting glimpse before he stuffed them into his pockets. And then he spoke, or at least I think he did. My eyes were still on his trouser pockets when the words registered. "Top of this ginnel," were the shrill words I heard, words I'm certain came from his tiny slit of a mouth in an extremely unusual voice, marked by an underlying raucousness. But his declaration suggested he knew something of the locality, despite his outlandish appearance. "Appreciated," I said, in a tone of voice that probably reeked of suspicion, but just what it was I distrusted then, I can't say. The man just gave me the willies, the good old-fashioned heebie-jeebies. With that, the man continued on his way, in a fashion that made me shudder. He glided past me, and it was as he did so that I noticed the lack of footwear, the lack of feet altogether. The long dark trousers reached the icy ground. Straight down they went, like a pair of pipes. Needless to say, I was glad to see the back of him, and the smell that went with him. I'd have a job comparing it to anything. Unwholesome it was. There's no need to delve too deeply into the history of Starry Edge. I'm sure you're familiar with the regional dispute. While the English portion of town is notably larger than the aforementioned Scottish quarter, anyone spending time here will sense an equal measure of national pride among the 100 or so residents of that smaller quarter. I mention this only because of the conversation that followed. A conversation between myself and the reclusive inhabitant of the Scottish quarter, Raven Barclay. I located Barclay's home at the very western extreme of Orchard Terrace, a striking, weathered bungalow overlooking a shadowy ravine. Bill Ranakar had told me all he could with regards to Barclay's situation, saying that the darkening of his door was a rare phenomenon even prior to his recent seclusion. According to Bill, the Starry Edge senior had spent most of his life as an arborist, and even in retirement could often be seen wandering from street to street, grove to grove, inspecting the town's many trees. He was polite enough, Bill had added, saying that old Raven would greet you warmly, but seldom join you for a drink at the pub. The snow had fallen a little heavier in the Scottish quarter. I trudged through Barclay's cluttered yard, passing snow-clad vehicles and tilting towers of scrap metal. On reaching the front door, I knocked loudly, coupling my efforts with the occasional call in his favor. Nothing, not so much as a creaking of floorboards. Undeterred and weirdly spurred on by my encounter with the stranger in the ginnel, I decided to circle round the back of the bungalow, where I located another door. This, I saw, was ajar. Not a good sign, given that it was -1 degree outside. Again, I knocked at the door, calling as I did so, but this only resulted in my forcing the door open a little more, and so, concerned for an elderly man's well-being, I pushed my way in, closing the door behind me. Curiously, it was still warm inside, suggesting that the door had been very recently opened. I was standing in the kitchen, a small space full of litter, with no apparent evidence of recent use, which further added to my concern. If Barclay hadn't left the house these last 7 days, what had he been living off? Slowly but surely, a scent assailed my nostrils. That same bittersweet aroma that had haunted me outdoors, that had assaulted me as the stranger had passed me in the ginnel. I followed the odor like an animal, seeking my prey. And there he was, Raven Barclay, parked in all his splendor on a tattered camelback, the dim glare of an antique standard lamp illuminating his generous frame, and generous it assuredly was. Barclay, 84 years of age, according to Bill Ranakar, was the size of a small elephant. Great mounds of flesh were boldly hinted at beneath a wool blanket. Thick, purple ankles plainly visible below it, disappearing into a peculiar shag-pile rug. Broad, round shoulders seemed to bear the weight of the world, surmounted by a pea-sized head, the archetypal pea on a drum, as a Lancastrian pal of mine would have said. And what a face! Like that of a pufferfish, complete with bulbous nose and short chin, deep-set eyes like stained pennies. Like the kitchen, the dimly lit lounge was cluttered with junk, likely the way old Barclay had always lived, though the disarray only heightened my sense of unease. I stepped toward him where he sat on the couch, but recoiled as the stench hit me. Then, without warning, Raven Barclay spoke, his whole body jolting awkwardly as he did so. It was like a mountain coming to life, a planet in the shape of a man. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and though his lips moved, it seemed to me that the voice came from somewhere else in the room, or somewhere else entirely. There was a weird quality to it, a subtle resonance that suggested alien ventriloquism. "Why's that?" I retorted, studying the bloated figure carefully. A moment passed before the voice sounded again. "I'm not one for visitors," he said, shuddering violently like a mound of jelly. "Never have been. You wouldn't understand, young man. Once you get to my age, you get to be wary of strangers. Hard to trust 'em, you see. That spark in your eye, full of life and luster, means nothing but trouble to an old-timer like me. It's always been the same." And he went on in this fashion for a good minute or two. Amazingly frank for a recluse, I thought. Almost as though the man spoke candidly against his will, which, as the disembodied nature of his voice suggested, probably wasn't far from the truth. "Used to be a Scottish town, you know. Went by a different name back then, though. Tal of Dhu. Aye, Tal of Dhu. Before they shifted the border, dragged it towards them. They wanted what lay in the ground, our special soil." "Special soil?" I said, when the man stopped talking. "Aye," the big man blurted, jolting again. "Can't control it if you don't own it." And then, quite suddenly, the big man exhaled a huge breath of air. Color washed over his face, and he coughed several times, his penny eyes flicking open, racing from left to right to left, over and over again. The bittersweet odor seemed to dissipate, followed by the opening of a door or window somewhere. It seemed to me that something had left not only the building, but the monstrous body of Raven Barclay. "Who the hell are you?" the old-timer shouted, the outburst coming directly from the spittle-covered lips that guarded the entrance to his giant mouth. "Get the hell out of my house!" "Wait," I protested, raising my hands defensively. "I'm a friend. I'm here to help." But my remonstrance fell on deaf ears. The bloated Barclay veritably screamed, "Get the hell out of my house!" And so I did. After all, one must respect a man in his own home, regardless of what he says or what one might suspect he's become. I left the way I'd entered, through the side door in the kitchen, now standing wide open. Fresh flurries of snow were kissing the tiled floor. The time had come to visit the harem behemoth. My encounter with Raven Barclay had left me with more questions than answers, not least about the thing that had seemed to be in possession of his body. And perhaps Bill Rannikar could explain what was so special about the soil in Starry Edge. For something in the earth had to be responsible for those odd, pink-headed flowers. I spotted another in Barclay's garden as I made my way out. 3. The Hare's a lovely little pub, detached, thatched, cramped, and cosy, the whole 9 yards. I'd have given it much more of my time and attention had I not been caught up in the business at hand. As it were, I stumbled into a plump chap with a camera on entering the place. "Whoa," the man blurted in a broad, Geordie accent. He'd practically knocked me off my feet. "You all right?" "Never mind me," I said, gathering myself. "How about you?" We shared a laugh, the man's fingers inadvertently thrumming the hefty SLR hanging from a strap about his neck. "No damage," he said, grinning. "Are you the PI?" "I am," I said, surprised at the man's insight. "Van Melsen. And you are?" "Neil Webber," the man proffered, extending a hand. freelance photographer. It's a pleasure, I said, clutching the tendered mitt. Weber, a man with big staring eyes and a wild head of orange hair, went on to explain that he was in Starry Edge on business, fulfilling a private hire contract on behalf of a wealthy client. Trouble on the Borderland, he said, referring to the job at hand. I don't suppose you've seen this guy, have you? Weber produced a small photograph, the kind taken with an instant camera. He handed it to me. A local took it 2 days ago. I said, buying time with a murmur, for I had indeed seen the character in the photograph. It was the red-headed man with the green eyes that I'd encountered in the ginnel. In the photograph, the man was seen to be coughing or vomiting, that crooked frame of his frightfully bent. Scattered in the snow at his feet were several small, circular objects, dark red in color, quite possibly the remnants of his retching. I saw him this very morning, I answered at last, looking up at Weber. His large eyes lit up at the announcement. An odd fellow, by all accounts. Seemed eager to get away from me. What did the photographer have to say about his encounter? Well, Weber began, he told me the guy wasn't from around here. Had been hanging around town for a day or two before he snapped the photo. When he spotted him puking at the bottom of his garden, he rushed out with his camera. Said he wanted proof, just in case the guy turned out to be trouble. I can't imagine the man was too pleased having his picture taken while throwing up, I commented. You're right there, Weber said. The moment the flash went off, the guy leapt to his feet and ran away. At this interval, Bill Ranacar entered the pub. He greeted us, evidently acquainted with Weber, and hollered in the direction of the man behind the bar, Johnson Turner, the landlord. I was introduced to Turner, a salt-of-the-earth fellow with half a grin permanently stamped across his face, and the four of us parked ourselves at the bar. It was an unusual turn of events as far as I was concerned. There was a sense of inevitability in our coming together, like the four of us were an assembly of militia preparing for some obscure maneuver. What have you got? Bill asked, eyeballing me wildly, as Turner, all businesslike, summoned 4 pints of Judas's courage. I'm not much of an ale drinker, but there and then it seemed only right to wrap my hands around a pint mug. I spoke of my encounter with Barclay, the open door, the massive form on the couch, the uncanny ventriloquism, the aggressive dismissal, told the 4 men precisely what I told you earlier. He isn't dead, then, said Turner, in that no-nonsense manner typical of all middle-aged barmen. Was he always on the large side? I asked, sipping my ale. Not unusually so, Bill said, shaking his head. This thing gets stranger and stranger. That it does, Weber agreed, looking once more at the photograph of the redhead. And then I just came out with it. What's so special about the soil here in Starry Edge? It was Turner who offered an answer. Abnormally rich, he said, wringing his hands greedily. Blacker than coal, denser than lead. That's all very interesting, I said, frowning. But why would Barclay, right mind or no, feel the need to tell me about it? The man's a tennis racket. Turner coughed dismissively. Been talking nonsense for decades. Lights in the sky, creatures in the woods, you name it, he's yammered on about it. You say that, Bill interjected, shaking his head, but he wasn't wrong about the disc, was he? I suspect that this is the detail you were hesitant to mention during our initial conversation, but at last I was beginning to understand why you contacted me. Bill and Turner were on the verge of sharing everything I needed to know, the root of the weirdness in Starry Edge, so I decided to bite my tongue and listen. This is what I learned. More than a dozen townsfolk claimed to have seen the disc, a flat, black shape hovering just above the tree line, northwest of town. No one could say exactly when it had appeared, but it was present at 7 a.m. on November 25th, when Raven Barclay stepped out to sweep his path clear of snow. Intrigued, he ventured closer, estimating the object to be around 10 meters in diameter. Despite its featureless blackness, it stood out starkly against the pink-hued sky. True to form, Barclay wasted no time spreading the word, sharing his sighting with anyone who would listen. Most dismissed him outright. His reputation preceded him, but the story travelled fast. The more open-minded residents made their way to the edge of the forest, and sure enough, the object was there, hovering silently. Among the witnesses were the very men recounting the tale, Bill Renecar and Johnson Turner. Then, abruptly, just after 10 a.m., the disc vanished, leaving the onlookers more than a little perplexed. Bill, Turner, a teenager called Janice, and one of the soon-to-be shut-ins, Daniel Snyder, tramped into the woods, searching for any signs of disturbance beneath the spot where the object had floated. Footprints were discovered in the snow, unusual prints made by unusual feet, round feet like paws with toes. By 3:30 p.m., 4 of the 5 shut-ins had locked themselves in their homes, their erratic behavior prior to doing so witnessed by several members of the community. 4:30 p.m., and Raven Barclay was confirmed as the 5th shut-in, when Bill and Janice attempted to pay him a visit to discuss the sighting. "What does it all mean?" This from Neil Webber, guzzling his ale. "Damned if I know," said Turner, sighing heavily. I offered my 2 pennies worth. "Sounds to me like something emerged from that object." Webber choked on his drink, stifling a snicker, but Bill and Turner might well have been statues. "Something?" Webber begged. I lit a cigarette, paused for dramatic effect. "Aye," I said, northern spirit filling my wiry frame. "Something." "Well, that clears that up," the photographer said, shaking his head and muttering incoherently. "Something like the individual in that picture," I clarified, nodding at the creased snapshot in Webber's hand. And a conversation followed in which we debated the nature of the stranger in our midst. He was undoubtedly an outsider. Not a soul recognized him. On more than one occasion he'd been observed on all fours, brushing away the snow with his bare hands, but nobody had labeled him potentially dangerous or particularly suspicious. The only curious thing he'd been seen to do was vomit, and this was caught on camera. Then the light bulb above me flashed. I'd been comfortable enough sharing my thoughts on the stranger's odd arrival in Starry Edge, but this latest revelation felt a bit too outré for my present company. In short, the notion occurred that the stranger was vomiting seeds that, thanks to the abnormally rich soil of Starry Edge, permitted a curious plant to grow and flower, even in the dead of winter. I went on to speculate that the flower's head might contain a singular pollen that, once ingested, had the potential to wreak havoc on the human body, triggering an overwhelming urge to withdraw from the world. Might this compulsion to isolate oneself be the result of some bizarre metamorphosis set in motion by the ingestion of that strange pollen? I sensed that my new friends were aware of the cogs whirring, and so I spat it all out, lighting another cigarette the moment I'd finished unburdening myself. Webber, amused by my earlier alien visitation idea, seemed a few feet closer to the ground this time round. He finished his ale and slumped on the bar stool, shaking his head. "Metamorphosis?" Bill repeated, his brow creased like an old newspaper. "I don't know," I said. "It's just a theory. There was a case in the States, 1979. A young boy confined to an apple orchard. Couldn't move. The trees had him." Webber laughed nervously, saying, "Where did you hear that one?" "I didn't need to hear about it," I stated. "I was there." Needless to say, I felt compelled to elaborate. Those early days were especially weird. That incident in New Hampshire put me on the road to becoming an investigator. But before I could get into it, the youngster, Janice Harris, her face white as chalk, rushed into the pub, screaming bloody murder. "Quick! Quick!" she howled. "It's Don Gribbin! He's dead! "4. Don Gribbin was dead all right. One needn't have been a medical examiner to draw that conclusion. All that remained of the poor chap was his head, and there it was, at the corner of Brierley Gardens and Memory Lane, resting obliquely on a mound of red snow. A group had gathered around the grisly remains, ceaselessly gasping, and in some cases emptying the contents of their stomachs onto the road. I covered the head immediately, sacrificing my favorite scarf, and in so doing caught a glimpse of the terrible expression etched on the senior's rumpled face. That grimace will be with me for the rest of my days, a perfect blend of shock and horror. I've never seen a better example. Within an hour, the police were at the scene, and had cordoned the area off, much to the relief of the residents of Brierley Gardens and Memory Lane. Questions were asked. Suspicious looks were awarded to those of us who hailed from further afield. The nature of Gribbin's decapitation was so unusual, though, that the detective chief inspector responsible for making inquiries seemed just as bemused as the rest of us. The locals were reticently tight-lipped. Not a word was uttered regarding the shut-ins. No talk of a stranger with a pink face, and nothing whatsoever suggestive of objects floating over the woods. Similarly, Weber and I played down our roles in the strangeness. We were merely tourists in the wrong place at the wrong time. Weber's fancy camera went a long way to verifying his claim, whereas I think the DCI saw something of an eccentric when he looked at me. Paid me little mind for the most part. Later, at the community center, the young lady who had made the gruesome discovery, Janice Harris, told the handful of us gathered there that she had seen old Don a few hours prior to his ghastly end. He'd been in the region of Val Mabry's cottage by Sable Park, looking a little tentative and bewildered. Weber and I, who'd formed a bond owing to the two of us being outsiders, proposed a trip to Mabry's place, and so it was that we, accompanied by Bill Ranikar and the soft-spoken librarian, Peggy McKinley, set out for Sable Park, just after 7 p.m. I'll always remember that walk, brief though it was. The air was cool but fresh, filling me with a sense of purity that I actively declined to pollute with cigarette smoke. The sky was perfectly clear, billions of sparkling eyes winking at me. The spiral arm of the galaxy, a monumental band of promise. The four of us walked in silence, our gazes frequently returning to the glistening ceiling above our heads, the unmistakable and pleasing sound of heavy boots crunching snow, the only sound. I thought about the disk and the man with the pink face that at this very moment was likely abroad in the quiet town, disturbed though the streets were by the unnatural death of one of its own. The thought of Gribbin's scowling head yanked me down to earth, and I deliberated the possible causes of such an unspeakable fate. Minutes later, we reached Mabry's ramshackle cottage, and immediately saw that something was amiss. "Do you think she's—" McKinley began, apparently uncomfortable with the idea of finishing her sentence. The door was open, wide open. Snow had drifted into a sizable vestibule, through which we entered the cottage, cautiously. Bill was the first to acknowledge the smell, that same bittersweet aroma that was beginning to aggravate me. Now, I have to make this clear. There were no outward signs of anything untoward having taken place in that room. No upturned furniture, no scattering of precious ornaments, no bodily fluids decorating the upholstery. But there was something very unusual to be seen. In the middle of the room, in front of a large sofa on the far wall, yawned a dark hole, at the bottom of which lay a thick root of some kind, with several smaller roots branching out of it. If a plant had once lived in that hole, there was no sign of it now, though the memory of Raven Barclay's ankles returned to me, disappearing into what I'd thought was some sort of shag pile rug. It doesn't look right, McKinley said, shining a torch into the aperture. Why do you say that? Webber queried, swapping a camera lens. It's black, the librarian went on. Probably root rot. I've already said that I'm no botanist, so I refrained from bringing Barclay's ankles into the debate. Things were strange enough. Bill stepped forward. Seriously, he said, who'd plant something in their living room floor? What's wrong with a plant pot? We were equally baffled, despite my suspicions. Had Don Gribbin called on Val Mabry at precisely the wrong time? What had happened to her? My thoughts were all over the shop. The idea that some sort of alien pollen had entered her system, transforming her into a giant half-plant capable of rooting itself in the ground, was both fascinating and horrifying. I could only imagine what she might have become, capable of detaching herself from her roots. What Gribbin gazed upon in those final moments, was her fate that of the other shut-ins, too? Systematically, we visited the dwellings of the other shut-ins, discovering in each case a similar set of circumstances that had existed at Val Mabry's: huge depressions in tattered couches, noxious odors in the stuffy air, cavities in the ground, black roots within. Webber took photographs at every location, capturing a good degree of the lingering strangeness. He even took snaps of the curious red-headed flowers we saw in close proximity to the houses, all of which seemed to have been interfered with, their powdery contents visible on the compacted snow. More than you bargained for? I asked Webber, recognizing the look of awe and wonder in his large, bloodshot eyes. Too true, he blurted, as a series of flashes illuminated the festering lair of Raven Barclay. I've never seen anything like it. I wish I could say you get used to it, I continued, puffing on a cigarette. Barclay's hovel seemed like an appropriate place to light up, but I'd be doing you a disservice. Yeah? The photographer said, turning to face me. The world's an uncanny place, I said, full of surprises. You can say that again. I wouldn't have believed it. I'm not sure I'll ever believe it. But all this... Webber waved his camera at Barclay's squash sofa and the dark hole in the floor. It's very persuasive. An old friend of mine once said, the most valuable commodity in the world is an open mind. I tend to agree with him. Webber nodded slowly, a look of deep contemplation filling his face. McKinley was studying the rotten root. This one was bigger than the others, and seemed to glisten under the glare of the torchlight. Over here, Bill shouted of a sudden. He was standing at the back of the sofa, clutching a large, tattered notepad. This turned out to be Barclay's handwritten account of what had happened following his initial sighting of the disc on November 25th. I brought it back to Barnard, so I'm able to include his scribblings verbatim. It's clear Barclay wasn't much of a writer, but it's the content of his account that really matters. As follows. November 25, 1990, 9 a.m. Am not making it up. Tells it like it is. There was something in the sky, and it were looking at me. I'm not the only one who saw it. Big black ring it were, flat as a disc. Another universe in it. Best stay in house for now. November 25, 2 p.m. There were a boy outside, redhead like my midder, brought me a flower, like a red blow bowl, blew it in my face, got right in the back of my throat, coughing all afternoon. Dunno what happened to boy. Tired now. Stay in house. November 26, middle of night. Hands are all puffy. Holding the pencil is a struggle. Legs are all blown up. Ankles hurting. Feel the need to sit down. I'll sit here for now. Tired. N28. Can't write much. Wrists hurt. Fingers hurt. Like a balloon now. I'm getting bigger and bigger. Can't move legs. Can't see feet. Think I'm a goner. Sorry, can't answer door. He won't let me. N30. He don't want me writing. Don't want me thinking. Can't move. Can't speak. Got hold of my feet. Pulled me down. But I'm in the stars. High up. I'm rooted with them. Their soil. Cross the border. Rooted. Half of me here. Half of me there. Be none of me left soon. None of me. That's all he wrote. Requires some reading, I know, but it sounds as though the man's describing some sort of invasion, a process of becoming rooted somewhere, while something takes control of his body. At least that was the impression I got reading it, a conclusion that Bill Ranakar evidently shared, as he proceeded to explain that there had always been strange tales told in Starry Edge, rumors pertaining to visitors, extraterrestrials, presenting themselves as foreigners looking to reconnect with old friends and long-lost relatives. The appearance of curious red flowers in the dead of winter wasn't a novel occurrence either. The plants, Bill said, were commonly associated with otherworldly visitors. Barclay's an old-timer, Bill went on, pointing to a faded photograph of the man himself hanging on the wall above a cobwebbed fireplace. A much younger Raven Barclay, looking handsome, healthy, and full of ambition. He's enough miles on the clock to have seen a lot of strangeness up here over the years. But the younger generations, mine included, have always taken the whole thing with a pinch of salt. Vinegar, McKinley blurted, approaching the two of us by the fireplace. Acetic acid. That ought to do it. Do what exactly? I asked, refusing to read between the lines. Kill the weeds, she said matter-of-factly. Quite the character, the librarian, a font of knowledge, presented as a tall, short-haired 30-something, her dark blue eyes shadowy reservoirs of mysterious deliberation. I took a liking to her in that moment. This was a lady who knew what needed to be done, and was prepared to make it so. Meanwhile, Weber was snapping away in the background, shot after shot, but no longer was his attention on the musky room and the abnormal pit. He was shooting the three of us, there by the fireplace, our respective expressions of surprise, resolve, and determination captured on film. I'm curiously eager to see those pictures. Weber tells me they're in the Post, though they'll also be appearing in an article on the subject. But that's another story. We left Barclay's and went directly to Bill's place on Victoria Road, careful to avoid the dazzling police presence that still remained on the corner of Brierley and Memory. Once there, he cobbled together 6 spray bottles, obtained by emptying various household cleaning products into the sink, and filled said containers with a potent solution consisting of salt, dish soap, and white vinegar. What a picture we cut, returning to the snowy streets, armed with our homemade weed killers. In short order, we saturated a total of 6 plants, all of which withered almost instantaneously on contact with our lethal potions. This was by no means an extensive search of the town we conducted, more a case of returning to spots where the offending plants had been previously seen. It was a strange thing to do by the light of the stars, millions of tiny eyes blinking above our heads, but it was our belief that such action couldn't wait. Who could really say what had become of the 5 shut-ins? A theory remains a theory until the evidence presents itself. But none of us could forget what had happened to poor Don Gribbin. Something unnatural had had its way with him, and our money was on Val Mabry, hideously transformed or otherwise. With the withering of the 6th plant, we found ourselves oddly underwhelmed, unsure of what to do next, while steering clear of the lingering police and keeping our eyes peeled for the so-called Pink Man. That stranger, at large in the town on the Borderland, was surely at the heart of everything that had unfolded. And so it was that at roughly 10:30 p.m., We found ourselves in the kitchen of my rented cottage. Coffee was brewed, and generously filled sandwiches were served, as we prepared ourselves for a late one. What a day! 5. I can't be sure of the time, but I can recall precisely where I was when I first heard the scuttling. The kitchen of the cottage was very small, and yet there we were, the four of us, leaning against the countertops, deep in discussion. There was cigarette smoke in the air, mingling with steam from the kettle, while the unmistakable odor of ground coffee filled the room. It was only slowly, almost reluctantly, that we began to notice the sound. The strangeness of the din was in its origin, for it seemed to come from several directions: the kitchen door, the window over the sink, the ceiling overhead, as though something had crept to the door, slithered up the wall, and settled on the roof, perched there, awaiting further instructions. "What the—" Weber muttered, limply clutching his camera. "I think," Bill began, only to be interrupted by a wild pummeling at the kitchen door. "Let me in," came the whispered shout. "Quick!" Before anyone could say anything, Weber was at the door, yanking it open. In stumbled the young lady, Janice Harris, puffing and panting, sweat dripping from her brow. "Janice?" McKinley blurted earnestly. "Are you all right?" The girl nodded, recovering herself. I handed her a glass of water, waiting patiently as she gulped it down. "They're outside," she managed at last, waving her hands about frantically. "Everywhere," she added, pointing up, down, left, and right. "They're on the roof, Mr. Van Melsen. I saw them on the walls." "On the walls?" Weber repeated. "Yeah," Harris said. "Like spiders. Big, bloated spiders." "What the hell are you on about?" Weber pleaded. He was trembling. McKinley took a step closer to the girl. "You're not talking about them, are you?" And each of us knew exactly who the librarian was referring to. Harris nodded slowly. "They're after us," Bill said, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "Quick, the bottles." We each took a bottle of the solution Bill had concocted and retreated from the kitchen, moving into the main living area. A large space it was, with a vaulted ceiling overhead. The scuttling sound started again, and as we stood there, huddled together like a colony of penguins, I couldn't help but see things out of the corner of my eye. Strange insects and monstrous shadows clinging to the beams above our heads, questing hither and thither. "Be ready," Bill warned, with a face like that of a cowboy, with his finger resting firmly on the trigger of a revolver. A series of flashes momentarily spooked us, as Weber, all geared up and enthusiastic, took a dozen photographs. How comical we must have looked, lurking in the gloom of a dark cottage, clutching spray bottles like crucifixes. The weed killer, our holy water. And then I heard a voice outside. A voice I'd heard before, shrill and raucous. Was it the voice of the Pink Man? I'm not sure what was said, though, for it spoke in a foreign language, and it was muffled by further scuttling sounds. But I didn't need to know what was said to know what would follow, for it was a command, a simple, direct instruction. And in they came, 2 windows shattered at once under the weight of the bodies that targeted them. At one end of the room stood, or squatted, Raven Barclay, at least what at one time had been the town patriarch. And at the opposite end, between us and the sofa, was another monstrous figure, a figure immediately identified by the startled whisper of Peggy McKinley. "Daniel?" she said, and there was something in addition to recognition in that single word, something much more personal. But Daniel was more plant than human now. He and Barclay on the other side of the room were vastly wide and short. with multiple tree-like limbs protruding from their portly torsos. Huge folds of skin were a sap green, slick and glistening, with dark orifices like ghastly nostrils here and there, oozing a black ichor, a fetid substance that dripped to the floor. Their broad, flattened heads contained two deep-set eyes, little more than slits, really, and horrible broad lips that concealed monstrous mouths I had no desire to see. Mercifully, Bill, animal wild of a sudden, went after the Daniel half-plant with his spray bottle, giving the thing a good dousing. Weber, electrified in a likewise fashion, darted towards Raven, applying a similar dosage to the elderly blob. The weed killer had the effect of acid on the grotesque beings. Screaming and shuddering, their viridian flesh began to shrivel, hardening as it did so. In the commotion, the Val Mabry half-plant forced her ample frame through the front door, followed closely by Rob Stanley and Mabel Mason, the three of them hissing and grunting, their giant botanical frames awkward and volatile. Straight into the clouds of weed killer they rushed, immediately succumbing to its devastating effects. I'll never forget the look on the vegetable face of Mabel Mason, a creature beyond recognition, black petals where a head of hair once was, ruby red eyes blinking, stick-like limbs flailing, and the screams of the withering half-plants, the death howl of the mandrake, multiplied many, many times. I think we went a little mad then, the five of us. I completely lost myself, leaping forward with the wild abandon of a maniac, yelling inarticulately, and repeatedly squeezing the trigger of my spray bottle like a man possessed. I was practically on top of Mason. My targets, those dreadful, blinking eyes, everything about them an insult to humanity. What she truly was, what any of them had become, I'll spend the rest of my life trying not to imagine. But there and then, it didn't matter. The five of us had a job to do. We were exterminators, keen to rid Starry Edge of a blight that would have had us all on the chopping board before dawn. None of us wanted to end up like poor Don Gribbin. God only knows what became of his body. How exactly the night ended, I'll never really know. Those horrible images blend with recollections of nightmares. I can pretend, at least, that most of those visions were glimpsed in dreams, a noble effort to suppress the truth of the happenings in that room with the vaulted ceiling. But I return now to my opening statement. Why is it that people refuse to believe we live in a haunted world? Having lived through everything I've just described, and in company too, it's impossible to imagine how the ignorant view the world. Are they ignorant? Or are they blessed? The most valuable commodity in the world is an open mind. Is that really true? Or are some of us punished for our mindfulness? I would argue we are, for who could live a normal life after witnessing the events at Starry Edge? Perhaps I've reached that age. I'm questioning my vocation. But none of this has anything to do with the investigation. Again, I beg your pardon. The cottage went up in flames. One of us left the hob on, though none of us can recall who. Well, you know how it is. No good was going to come from the authorities discovering those husks we'd left inside. And husks they were, shriveled shapes that no longer resembled plant or animal. The rest is immaterial. I parted ways with my new friends, promised to return, and left for Newcastle with Weber. A few nights in the city proved to be hugely beneficial to my shattered mind. Weber seems all right, though. A horror shared by many trumps a horror faced alone. So, I suppose you're expecting a conclusion to all this. Well, I'll tell it like it is. A black disk in the sky. A door opened by a creature from another world. This thing coughed up its seed. Strange plants grew in the special soil. Locals ingested the pollen and were driven to nest in the privacy of their homes. Rooted in the earth, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, a strange metamorphosis occurred. They came for us, either at the behest of the Pink Man, whose absence at the end didn't go unnoticed, or due to some new, inexplicable drive or hunger, a need to procreate, perhaps. And I only say this latter, for the things appeared to hesitate after coming crashing through the windows. They studied us with their dark, lustful eyes. In addition to the now missing shut-ins, the authorities are still searching for the body of Don Gribbin. I suspect it's below ground, imbued with a strange, alien germ. As for the Pink Man, I doubt they've seen the last of him in Starry Edge. And that's all I've got to say on the subject. If you want more, perhaps you should seek out Neil Webber. He took some fabulous photographs. I need to get some sleep. A dreamless sleep, I hope. Yours, Peter. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,